What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so I am moving. I am moving to Colorado, and usually whenever I go on like trips or I'm moving or something like that, I just kind of throw out some pretty easy to digest stories, nothing too complicated or nothing too wild. We finished Jason Aaron's run on the Incredible Hulk, which I think is a pretty good stopping point. After that, I think it doesn't really get very interesting, and we can just kind of dead end into the events of all new, all different Marvel. But for this video, I wanted to cover the 198 because this deals with the God Mutant. It deals with Mr. M, Absalom Mercator. This guy is nuts. Like, it's crazy the kind of things that he can do. Now, he had appeared in Marvel Comics prior to the events of House of M, and he took up residence in a place called Mutant Town. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, Mutant Town was one of these places in the realm of Marvel Comics that was basically home to mutants for a lot of different people. And so the idea was that it was really like a mutant-only area, but it was really kind of like for cast-offs or people who really hadn't just found their way, who weren't part of the X-Men, they weren't part of a villain team, just kind of like a no man's land for a lot of the mutant population. Some chose to live there, some chose to live regular lives and live other places, but the fact remains that Absalom had kind of found a place for himself there by just being a handyman. That's really all he did. He just kind of hung out, and that was really about it. But he's a guy that has the ability to warp reality, and so it's really kind of crazy in terms of stuff that he can do. Truth be told, what we see here in this story, I think is about as extreme as his powers ever got in terms of us seeing what it is that he can do, but it's pretty impressive too, some of the things that he can pull off. But the 198, this story takes place almost immediately after the events of House of M, which is to say, after the Scarlet Witch warps reality. And in fact, it actually picks up with Magma. Now, Magma is a character who's been around for a long time. She was made by Bob McLeod, I think it was, and Chris Claremont, but she goes back quite a way. She was part of the New Mutants. She was part of the Hellions. She had a relationship with Empath for a while, which is actually something that's invoked in the story. But at the time that this aspect is being done, this era in her life, she is a teacher for the Xavier Institute and had actually gone on vacation with her boyfriend, Antonio. Now, as far as I'm aware, there's not a lot of information given about Antonio. Where Magma has the ability to, literally manipulate magma and so on and so forth, Antonio looks like a guy who can manipulate fire. And the two actually go together pretty well. And so he actually convinces her to leave, like to take an extra week on her vacation. And they just go to like La Cumbra, I think is what it is, to a volcano, basically, and just kind of poke around and have fun and explore their powers and so on and so forth. The problem with this is that, remember, when the Scarlet Witch warped reality and she basically created House of M and then said no more mutants and set everything back, what it did is it created this wave that spread throughout the world and just started stripping people of their powers. So it's like an ocean of power that was just riding around the planet, and people were just losing their abilities when it passed over them. In this instance, the loss of Antonio's powers coincide with the fact that they're inside a volcano. So he's literally melted alive just by the sheer heat and the magma itself. Magma would have been able to stop this, right? Like, she would have been able to prevent it, but it happened so quickly and so suddenly that there was no saving this guy. And so in a fit of rage, she loses her mind and lashes out. Now from here, we pick up with a couple of ancillary characters, for example, a group called Purity. Now Purity is not to be confused with William Stryker's Purifiers. They're a whole different organization, and they'll be focused on, in the events of Messiah Complex, assuming that we get around to it. But the Purity group is really more of just like street thugs masquerading as, hey, we're making the streets pure of mutants, so on and so forth. But following the events of House of M, with word getting around to a lot of people in the world that the, 2.8 some odd million mutants have basically lost their powers, that what this does is it sets in motion the idea of a lot of these anti-mutant groups rising to prominence more so than they were before. Instead of slinking around in the shadows, taking pot shots here and there, they effectively came out of hiding because now they have the courage with there being so few mutants left. And so because of this, it immediately draws the attention of a guy by the name of Toad. Of course, a young woman is attacked, because of the fact that these Purity guys are kind of crazy, but Toad, of course, helps her out, but this girl was basically scalped in the process. Now, in terms of Absalom Mercator himself, we actually end up picking up in Bellevue Hospital with the psychiatric wing and the arrival of Absalom Mercator. Now, of course, what he does is he actually meets a girl by the name of Hannah Levi. Now, Hannah Levi was a girl who basically had a tongue, like a prehensile tongue like Toad, but she has no real like crazy powers, right? Like, she's not like a telepath or a telekinetic or anything like that, but she's drawn the attention of Mr. M because they were friends in Mutant Town. So again, Mr. M's kind of going after those people that he was friends with, individuals who may have lost their powers or something along those lines. But Hannah Levi is basically a crazy chick, she's more or less insane. And Absalom Mercator actually cures her of her insanity by basically reworking the synapses in her brain. But of course, Absalom's also aware of the fact that mutants everywhere have been depowered. And so Hannah basically, besieges him to actually travel over to the Xavier Institute Institute and see if it's possible to fix the various mutant population to see if he can either restore their powers or at the very least try to provide some measure of order. Now, the crazy thing about his character is he actually arrives at the Xavier Institute, and when he does, he phases through a solid wall and immediately takes out the Sentinels. Now, these are not the Sentinels that you're used to. These Sentinels belong to the Office of National Emergency. Now, the Office of National Emergency was basically organized and structured for two purposes. The first was to deal with the possibility of mutant threats, and the second was to protect the mutant population in the event that something like this happens. And so what happened is, following the events of House of M, what we had talked about in Decimation was the idea that the Office of National Emergency was mobilized. The Sentinels, as they exist here, are actually manned, meaning they're not autonomous, they're controlled by individual people, and they basically stand outside and around the Xavier Institute to keep people in and to keep people from getting out. And so because of this, with Absalom just kind of showing up and just walking through walls effectively, some people view him as something akin to a mutant messiah, while others view him as dangerous. Now, of course, the X-Men are the ones that view him as being the most dangerous. In this example, Emma Frost and Cyclops. But of course, they're also in somewhat of a weird situation too, because prior to this, there was a lot of Xavier going on, in the sense that prior to Xavier taking off, hanging out with Magneto while the Scarlet Witch was being dealt with before she warped reality, Xavier would basically answer these questions, teach people the things they needed to know. But right now, Cyclops and Emma Frost are flying by the seat of their pants, because the first instance in which they basically become headmaster and headmistress of the school officially, meaning that they are basically running everything on their own, absent Charles Xavier in his entirety, which means no one knows where he is, things go absolutely awry. Everybody's looking at the Xavier Institute as a safe refuge. Things are about as crazy as they can get. And then suddenly they have this guy Epsilon that just shows up and he's doing things like automatically evolving organisms, manipulating reality on a scale that people can't really begin to comprehend. Not only that, this girl Lorelei, who had basically, been scalped by these purity guys, he just immediately regrows her hair. This is the kind of power that we're talking about here. And so leading to the war room, a conversation between the X-Men, the core members of the group, addressing everything that's going on. The first thing that comes up, for discussion is Mr. M himself. Now, of course, going through their analysis, looking at his powers, looking at what he's capable of, the first thing they say is, this guy is an Omega level mutant. Now, in truth, Mr. M is beyond Omega level, and there's only a handful of mutants who are like that, but he is a beyond Omega level mutant, meaning that there is no limit to the abilities that he has, and he's a universal threat, which means that he could presumably be, kind of evolve into this universal being, a cosmic entity or something along those lines. Now, that's usually the case when it comes to people who can warp reality on such a scale in the same way that he can. So of course, where the X-Men can't really wage war against a guy like this, because of the fact that he seems to be coming in peace, they just kind of let things go and say, look, we'll keep an eye on him. We'll just kind of keep things in check and we'll eventually see what's going on. Now, with regards to the 198 and this sort of turmoil that begins to erupt, this all really starts from the idea that some of them want to leave. And this is when we start running into the issue of no one gets in, no one gets out. So for those people who are in here, some of them look at it as a safety place, look at it saying, look, these various extremist groups cannot get to us. For others, they look at it and say, this is a prison, we're not allowed to leave. Now, of course, what this does is this brings in Valerie Cooper. Now, Valerie Cooper has a long-standing history in Marvel Comics. She was basically, the government liaison for X-Factor, but by being associated with the X-Factor team, which in turn was associated with the X-Men, it made her friends to a wide array of the mutant population when it came to superheroes, and it made her an enemy to a lot of villains. Valerie Cooper is about the closest thing the X-Men have to a friend when it comes to the government sector of the United States. So because of this, Valerie Cooper is the one that basically organized all this stuff. She's head of the Office of National Emergency. She's the one that's basically safeguarding the mutants. But ultimately, this rebellion or this revolution of sorts is leading to some turmoil just because of the fact that there are those who want to leave, but they're not really allowed to leave. Now, of course, Absalom Mercator steps up yet again in the middle of this conflict and basically says, look, you guys don't need to be fighting. He literally brings everything to a halt. Like, he just stops the Sentinels and simply just, again, gives us another display of the extreme power that he possesses here. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. The stuff he's going to do later on is going to be absolutely nuts. But we also pick up with a guy by the name of John D. Now, John D is kind of a weird situation here. And the reason why I say that is because of the fact that John D or Johnny D or whatever you want to call him is basically a new introduction to Marvel Comics, but he's kind of strange. He has this weird appendage in his chest, but what it basically does is it creates voodoo dolls of people. So all he has to do is introduce a strand of DNA and it'll pop out this little voodoo doll that he can basically control to make it do almost anything he wants to. In this first instance, because of the fact that he had spoken with Magma because he had pulled a piece of her hair, it ultimately gives him the ability to make a sort of voodoo doll of her that he can use for, whatever purpose, and her physical body will do whatever it is that he does with that doll. Now, of course, from here, we pick up with this first major revolution among the 198. And the reason why is because of the fact that these mutants who are residing within the Xavier Institute are basically told, look, because of the fact that some of you guys wanted to leave, we can allow you to do that. But the problem is you cannot leave unsupervised. Now, this is the danger of this whole thing. In truth, Valerie Cooper has the best interests of the mutant population at heart. She's literally doing what she believes to be the right thing. And what she says is, we are going to allow you guys to leave under two conditions. The first is that you guys carry an emergency cell phone, so that you guys can basically contact the Office of National Emergency if anything pops off, people try to attack you, whatever the case may be. But we're also going to tag you guys so that we can keep track of your location. Now, the first part isn't a huge thing. Walk around with a cell phone, whatever. Most folks will probably just make long distance calls and probably abuse it. But the problem with being tagged is that now they feel like animals, and rightfully so, because that's the whole crazy thing about this. One thing you guys got to keep in mind is that when it comes to a lot of these mutants who are residing within the Xavier Institute, they all come from different walks of life. Some of whom who have extremely exotic appearances took up residence in Mutant Town, where they didn't have to worry about the oppression of people. Others were Morlocks. They resided underground. Not all of them had the benefit of walking around like Emma Frost, with no one having any idea that they have telepathy or some power that's simply undetectable by physical appearance. And so for a lot of these folks, all they've known is struggle and strife. All they've known is people giving them a hard time because of their physical appearance, or because of the way their powers manifest, or because they can't control their abilities, or any number of things. And then to be told, hey, look, this is a safe haven that you cannot leave unless you allow yourself to be imprinted with a tag. This inevitably leads to conflict. It inevitably leads to battle between all these different individuals. Now, of course, what also ends up happening here is we end up finding out that, again, Johnny D's been going through and making all these different voodoo dolls of all these different mutants that reside within the Xavier Institute. Now, he doesn't have all 198, but that still makes it pretty dangerous because he could single-handedly instigate a rebellion in and of himself. Now, at this point, we actually pick up with a guy by the name of Mamomax, I think it is how you pronounce his name. But he's a guy who basically has the form of an elephant. But the problem with this is he's one of a handful of individuals who left, who agreed to getting tagged, and then ultimately ended up taking off. The problem with this is that when he's basically insulted by a normal person and begins to lash out, what we end up finding out is that where Valerie Cooper was told these tags only serve the purpose of monitoring where these mutants go, we actually end up learning that these tags also contain an electric shock that will literally keep them in check, that will keep them from lashing out. And if they do lash out, it'll basically shock them and subdue them. Now, the reason why this is so significant is because of the fact that the fear of these mutants comes true. They're basically being treated like animals. If they act out, they get an electric shock until they learn what to do and what not to do. They're very much being treated like dogs. The other half of this is that one of these guys basically goes about sort of, doing his own thing, but he's a drug addict. Now, where a voodoo doll had been created by Johnny D begins to experiment, begins to toy around, and in the process strangles the voodoo doll, which in turn kills this mutant. Now, the problem with Jazz basically dying here is that people don't know exactly why, and mutants, these various mutants who feel threatened, begin to make false corollaries. What they basically say is, well, Mamomax over there said that he was shocked by his tag, and Jazz over here died, so that means that the tags are killing people. That's the conclusion that they come to. Now, Valerie Cooper is basically told, look, here's the whole reason why this is being done. Of course, getting the information from her superior, General Laser, at the Pentagon, who's really the guy kind of spearheading this whole thing. And what he does is he actually makes a legitimate case. He says, look, the reason why we tag these guys is because when you have that many people from that many walks of life who are all confined in a singular space, it's only a matter of time before something pops off. Whether we're the ones that caused it or whether they caused it on their own, they were inevitably going to lose their minds. To paraphrase Star Wars, they're animals and we're treating them like animals because in a lot of ways, they're acting out just like children. But the other half of this is that they're terrified. All they know is that some of them died and they don't know why, or at least one of them died and they don't know why. And so when their life is on the line and they feel like prisoners, it's a return to the life that they tried to escape from when they joined the Xavier Institute in the first place. And so ultimately what ends up happening is in the middle of all this fray, Absalom Mercator shows up and starts taking people's tags out of their necks, because the tags are attached to their skulls. They can't pull them off on their own, but he begins popping out, their tags using his ability to transmute matter and basically says, look, by the declaration of Cyclops himself, those who don't want to be here are allowed to leave. So if anybody wants to leave with me, we're walking out of here and there's nothing they're going to be able to do to stop me, which there isn't. There's nothing they can do to stop him. And this is when we get another example of his reality warping power. He walks up to the eastern wall and transmutes matter. So he basically breaks the wall apart and creates a doorway for himself. That's the kind of power we're dealing with here. That's why it's so crazy and that's why it's so extreme, because what do you do with a guy who can literally do anything? When he's leading all these people, when he's doing things like walking on water, that's why things become so dangerous, because now Absalom Mercator is not this mutant that has the ability to warp reality. Now he's a messiah. People look at him and say, oh, he's going to lead us to the promised land. They look at the extreme power he possesses and they start viewing him as a mutant god. And so that's why things get really, really dangerous here, because now faith comes into the equation. This inevitably leads to Cyclops and Emma Frost and so on, these guys showing up where Absalom Mercator has taken these mutants mutants, this little island right outside of the Xavier Institute, and says, you guys have to come back. Now keep in mind, Cyclops does not want a battle here. One, because they have no hope of winning if they were to actually fight Absalom Mercator under normal circumstances. And two, because of the fact that he's trying to preserve what's left of the mutant population. The mutant population, when it comes to people who gain powers, it's not like normal humans. With mutants, there's no guarantee that if mutants procreate, that another mutant could be born. We've seen a litany of stories where the mutant gene suddenly just ends. It just stops. And that's really the concern that mutants have here, is because with there being no guarantee that two mutants procreating will lead to another mutant, their numbers at 198 are small enough as it is. And it's entirely possible that with 98% of mutants losing their powers, that there will be no mutants born. Now, of course, that's really the premise of everything that takes place between this story and Messiah Complex with the birth of Hope Summers. But that's still a very legitimate concern for Cyclops and his crew. And so what ends up happening here is where a conflict initially, begins to erupt, and we end up finding out that Johnny D is basically manipulating the bodies of these various mutants to instigate a conflict. We also end up learning that Johnny D is basically working for the Office of National Emergency, working for General Laser, and putting his powers to nefarious uses, literally instigating a conflict that will result in this sort of mass destruction among all these mutants. And so what ends up happening here is Absalom just kind of lets loose. He literally just encases everybody and says, no one is going to fight. There is not going to be any conflict here. You will not harm my people. Now, again, this is an extreme demonstration of power, because with a guy that can warp reality, if he's angry at you, then you're probably done with all your living. And that's exactly what's going on here. I mean, he's not really killing people, but it's the possibility that with a wave of his hand, suddenly everybody except his people are gone. Any number of things could happen. That's the kind of power that you're dealing with. We end up having Johnny D using his powers along, to basically create this conflict between these mutants. But with Absalom Mercator having such extreme abilities, his attention immediately focuses on him. And so where a lot of these mutants are acting against their own characters, where they're doing things they wouldn't normally do, Johnny D basically uses the power of Leech to touch Absalom Mercator and take his power away. Now, this is a pretty significant thing, because remember, when it comes to the character of Leech, he was always identified as a mutant that had the ability to touch other people and suppress their mutant powers. But we didn't know how far that went. Really, up until this story, we didn't know if there was an upper echelon where there's just a level of power that he just cannot deactivate because it's intrinsic to the environment around them. That's really the way a lot of mutant powers work. With the character of Absalom Mercator, if he can warp reality on a universal scale, does that mean that he's part and parcel to the universe itself? And if so, is Leech trying to deactivate his power the exact same thing as trying to destroy eternity? Absalom being able to manipulate reality is just a byproduct of his mutant factor. And if Leech can shut off his power, he can shut off the power of anybody that he comes across. So I would surmise that in truth, Leech is probably the most powerful mutant in the world by virtue of the fact that the best defense or the best offense is a strong defense. If you can shut off the power of anybody that exists, who's going to oppose you? I mean, all it would take is Leech with a handgun walking around the world, and the mutant population doesn't exist anymore. The fact remains, shutting off the power of Absalom Mercator also allows Johnny D to basically manipulate the power of magma and destroy Absalom's physical body. So again, it's kind of a MacGuffin, kind of a caveat that leads to Absalom Mercator being defeated, and it's effectively demoralized the entirety of the rebel population among this mutant group. But ultimately, what this means now is they just resign to their fate. They don't know what's going to happen next. And so in this last little moment here, what we end up finding out is that where funeral's more or less being held, this kind of visitation for Mr. M, that his coffin's actually empty, and that he's kind of evolved into a next, stage of evolution, in the sense that he just kind of manifests as butterflies. It's kind of weird. The guy liked butterflies, he comes back as butterflies. I don't really know. But it really just kind of ends on this high note, basically saying that nothing ever really dies, things just sort of evolve. And it's this kind of positive note that is kind of the calm before the storm, in the sense that everything following this gets pretty dark for the X-Men. Things get pretty brutal. Nonetheless, this really just kind of covers the events immediately following the House of M. Everything after this basically leads up to Second Coming, Messiah Complex, the 12 Lights, Messiah War, all that kind of good stuff. And then after that, it leads into the Dark Reign era, the Heroic Age, all those different things like that. But in any event, if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.